Well, joining us today is Jerry Peterman. Now, he's a real Renaissance man. He's a scientist, an inventor, an entrepreneur, a writer. We're going to talk to him about some of his fiction works here, but we're going to talk to him mainly about his engineering work. Now, that's varied as well. He's got patents on wireless communication, artificial intelligence. He's done active work on DNA research, but what we're most interested there with is his work on radiation, particularly Fukushima, and trying to assess really what our risks are here in this Fukushima event. And he has a site called FukushimaUpdateReport.com where he aggregates information about Fukushima and has been doing that now, Jerry, for 3 years, because almost we're up to about the 3-year anniversary of Fukushima, and it just keeps going and going and going. It's kind of the Energizer Bunny of nuclear disasters, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
It's really shining. Now, we have a lot of viewers who like to take charge of their own health. They do a lot of research. They work to make sure that they've got food supply, that they can prepare for disaster. How do they determine what their exposure is to nuclear reaction and to nuclear radiation? We've talked about the different types. Talk a little bit about the different types of radiation.
I don't know if they can determine it because the government has certainly raised the levels of acceptable radiation as soon as this happened, which I found very, very strange. I think the best thing to do is just not live on the West Coast. That would be the best thing to do, especially Washington, Oregon area, because that area gets the blow-by from the winds across the Pacific a lot sooner than anywhere else. As far as the kinds of radiation there are, you have multiple kinds of either particulates or wave radiation. Well,
before we get to that, let's talk about, because a lot of people are confused just about electromagnetic radiation, because we do talk a lot about the negative effects of cell phones, of smart meters, of living under power lines. That radiation, electromagnetic radiation, is much different than ionizing radiation, like you're talking about alpha, beta, gamma rays, that sort of thing. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, basically, if you have radiation from cell phones or power lines and that kind of thing, that doesn't strip off electrons from your atoms. It doesn't. It's not ionizing radiation. It's capable of boiling water, as in microwave radiation, but that's really it. When you have nuclear radiation, then you have the ability to destroy DNA, to strip off electrons of atoms. I mean, it's a whole different ballgame.
And of course, you can just switch off the electrical device that's producing the electromagnetic radiation, but you can't switch off nuclear radiation. That's what makes it so dangerous, that it goes on for thousands, millions of years.
That's correct, even billions of years. In Fukushima, the depleted, well, any nuclear power plant that produces depleted uranium, the half-life, or in other words, how strong it is, if the half-life is, say, 4.5 billion years, as in depleted uranium, that means 4.5 billion years, it's half as strong as it is today. So that's pretty powerful.
So when we have a nuclear incident, because what happened in Fukushima could very easily happen here. We just had the former head of the NRC this last summer came out and said, it's been reported widely, the New York Times carried it, he said we need to shut down every nuclear reactor in the United States because they share the same fundamental design flaw as the Fukushima reactor. And so we could have a Fukushima anywhere in the United States. We could have multiple of these events anywhere in the United States. So if that were to happen, how does someone evaluate their exposure to that? You know, it's not just a West Coast isolation now, it's within the United States. How do they, as an individual, how do they prepare for that, to measure that?
I'm not sure you can. An average person can't discern what a survey meter or Geiger counter, what the readings mean, because you don't know. Actually, a nuclear person may not even be able to tell with a survey meter, because you can't tell what kind of radiation you're dealing with. Are you dealing with particle radiation? Are you dealing with alpha, which is a particle, beta, which is a particle, or a gamma or X-ray, proton, neutron radiation? You don't know what you're dealing with. You really have to know what isotopes have been released from that particular accident
So there's a qualitative as well as a quantitative issue with the radiation.
Absolutely.
And you're saying that the Geiger counter just gets the quantitative aspect of it, but there's still an issue of the qualitative. So talk about the different types of radiation, like the differences between alpha, beta, and gamma radiation.
Alpha is very interesting because it's a particle. It can be stopped by a sheet of paper or basically by your skin. But if you get it into your body, you can end up with, say, the lungs, you can end up with lung cancer very easily. Beta is more powerful, and it has the ability, of course, all of it has the ability to strip electrons and that kind of thing, so it's ionizing. And beta is a lot more serious than alpha would be. And then you get into the various kinds of wave radiation, and that would be the X-ray or the gamma, that kind of thing. And of course, there's also, you've heard of the neutron bomb.
Mm-hmm.
That is the type of radiation, that's a neutron emitter, and that's about as deadly as it gets.
Now, the Fukushima event's been going on for about 3 years, coming up in just a couple of weeks. The concern is, now they've tried to downplay the concern by saying that it's diluted by the fact that it's going into the water. However, the reality is that it's also being bioaccumulated throughout the food chain. And that's very different. That's something you don't see with ordinary pollutants typically like you do with radiation because it's so persistent. It never gets metabolized. It just keeps accumulating and getting passed down the food chain. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, basically, in a bioaccumulation situation, you have tiny organisms that are eaten by larger organisms. And that goes all the way up to, say, in the ocean, to large fish like tuna, because they eat smaller fish, and smaller fish ate something smaller until it gets down to plankton. And the plankton may have just a tiny bit of radiation there, but by the time you have accumulated all of this material, you begin to have some fairly active material. I'll give you an example of bioaccumulation. We're now seeing a lot of trees and various other pollutants in southeast Texas from the lignite coal-fired plants. And I was opposed to that in the 80s of even building that because you had, it was 80s, because you have lignite that has a tiny amount of background radiation in it, but it accumulates at the rate of 10,000 time reduction in volume. So what was a small amount in a huge amount of material, when that material is reduced to an ash, then it becomes an accumulated amount. And that being released into the atmosphere then is far worse than it just occurs in nature. And that's the problem with all the radiation that we have regarding nuclear power plants. Mm-hmm. Because we've taken something in nature that is really not very strong, and we have, run it through centrifuges until we've got it down to
highly concentrated, highly refined, exactly.
And then when you start putting it together, it produces other forms of matter that don't exist in nature. For example, plutonium. Mm-hmm. Plutonium does not exist in the Earth. We have created that through the process. Mm-hmm. And a few other various kinds of isotopes that are created by that process.
Now, one of the things that you said that was very interesting in that you're talking about a natural radiation that occurs in the lignite coal. We were told in California, don't worry about this radiation that you're picking up because it's just natural radiation. It might be thorium, it might be radium. And of course, in McClellan Air Force Base, they took a lot of radium that was used for instrumentation at the Air Force, and they just buried it on the base in massive quantities, massive concentrated amounts. People were concerned about that entering the water supply. They wanted them to take it somewhere away from a population center at the very least, but instead it was going to be inconvenient and expensive for the Air Force, so against the wishes of local government, the state government, they just buried it on site.
That doesn't surprise me at all. You remember we were talking a few years ago about burying everything, and it was NIMBY, not my backyard?
Yes.
Okay, we were going to bury everything that was accumulated from waste in the United States from nuclear power at Yucca Flats.
Yes.
We were going to go out and we were going to encapsulate it in glass and stick it in there. We have very little left now to bury. And nobody talks about burying. Well, why don't they talk about burying? because the government went back to their buddies and they bought all the rods, and the rods were then turned into munitions, and the munitions were then dumped on in the Mideast war. So we now have 40,000 tons of material which has been dumped on Iraq and Afghanistan. Now,
so instead of burying it somewhere, we just turn it into weapons and shoot it at our enemies.
yes, and a gift that keeps on giving, because now those people have to deal with something where they are going to have to deal with it for 4.5 billion years.
Gosh. It is just, we had talked about this briefly just before the interview, how horrific these pictures of children and infants, the birth defects from depleted uranium, and how concentrated they are in the Fallujah area. And then, of course, it's not limited to just the people of Fallujah. It also affects the U.S. Army veterans who were shooting it in their tanks, and for the longest period of time that was not allowed in the American military. But then again, they took off that ban and they said, go for it, guys. They really didn't care about the health of their soldiers.
David, you have to remember who took it off. We're dealing with people that think Bohemian Grove and the Big Owl is a good thing. We're dealing with people who celebrate a ceremony called the death of care. That is a misnomer. It should be the death of conscience, because it takes a person with no conscience to be able to kill forever. As I mentioned to you before the interview, we were talking about people who maybe become angry and they have a fight, and a few months or a year later, they're their best friends. It is the same with nations. We would fight a war, and 10, 15, 20 years, that's a trading partner. That's a friend again. We don't have that opportunity now with the Middle East, because that's a hot zone that nobody ever will go back to. And those people are dead forever. That makes no sense. And that's in the environment now, released into the environment. The only good thing about that, having been released in the environment, is that it is a heavy element that doesn't readily blow in the wind. It does to some degree, but it doesn't spread as fast as some of the nuclear material that we have from Fukushima, that lighter elements that came across.
Now, one of my concerns about nuclear power has always been the waste disposal. And as you mentioned, a massive amount of the waste disposal was weaponized and used in the Middle East. But we still have massive accumulations of it at nuclear reactor sites. And one of the things I think was unique about Fukushima was it brought to the public they realized finally that it wasn't just a nuclear reactor problem exploding that we've seen in 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, but we also had to be concerned about the safety and the perpetual care and maintenance of these nuclear storage sites that are at the site of the nuclear facilities. And that's one of the reasons that this former head of the NRC is saying that we need to fundamentally change these designs, because they're so reliant on the continuing source of power to keep not only the reactors cool, but to keep these waste pools cool.
Absolutely. Now, I said to Alex a few days ago in an interview, it's lunacy to do what we've done in the first place, because if we ever lose cooling for the nuclear power plants, these plants will go critical. Well, what would it take to lose cooling? It simply takes large belts from the sun to produce something called a Carrington event, which is enough to shut down through electromagnetics, shut down the power grid, or fry small electronic components. For example, you couldn't get a truck started to run a diesel engine to pump water into there if all the systems had fried within the plant. Now, we've got a minimum of 711 nuclear power plants in the world, and a Carrington event could easily wipe out all the electronic systems that would control every single one of them, which means we have no way to cool any of them. And here we are with a planet-wide extinction event. It's an insane thing. But I want to come back to what Einstein said. A journalist once approached Einstein with the question, assuming Einstein would have been very proud of nuclear power because it was a peaceful use of nuclear. And Einstein smiled and said, it's a hell of a way to boil water.
Yeah, that's right. It's a massive Rube Goldberg way to boil water, one of the most complicated ways mankind has ever devised to burn.
But there's more to that. If I, for example, went out in the backyard, took a large pot, and boiled an equivalent amount of water with heat from a fire that could be produced with heat in a power plant in a single day, I could boil water. In a year, you'd find the ashes. 10 years, you might. 100, you won't. 1,000 or 10,000 or 1,000,000, you'll never find where I boiled the water. But the same amount of water boiled for a single day with nuclear power, 4.5 billion years later, you can find that material, and it's still half as effective as it was before. I contend that's nuts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, other than the former head of the NRC, do you see anything, because you follow this issue very closely, do you see anybody else calling for massive rethinking of the nuclear power industry?
Oh, there's a lot of people. A lot of environmentalists are calling for that. There's a lot of, for example, I know I was on the Power Hour with Joyce Riley and with Mr. Gunderson. And we were talking about that kind of thing, and it's the type of insanity that we need to get a hold of, and we need to get a hold of it quick. And Arnie Gunderson has that opinion as well. It's just like it's an insane thing to do, and he used to be an insider who worked on these things and designed these kinds of pieces of equipment.
I just recently went to a fair where they were talking about solar power for your own backyard and a lot of other things, and they had a guy up there telling everyone that it was a real tragedy that we weren't moving to nuclear power, that some environmentalist groups had opposed nuclear power and that was going to destroy the planet because of carbon dioxide. I mean, do you find that credible? That they would accept things like plutonium, depleted uranium, and yet choke on the idea that carbon dioxide is here, even though the plants can dispose of that. There's nothing that thrives or disposes of plutonium or depleted uranium.
No, I find that ludicrous. I think those people are completely crazy. That makes no sense at all. Mm-hmm. I'm shocked by that.
Yeah, but I have seen that. I've actually seen environmentalist sites saying that nuclear energy is better than solar because it has less of a carbon footprint. And they talk about creating solar panels and how much energy that takes. I mean, that's their calculus. They start from a false assumption that carbon dioxide is the most dangerous thing on the planet, which is demonstrably false. And then they extrapolate it back from that to say that the best, cleanest form of energy is nuclear. So that was my concern about it. I'm hoping that people will see the other side of this equation, really understand what's dangerous about these substances.
I'm sorry. I guess I'm a conspiracy theorist. I'd say follow the money. Who paid them?
That's right.
You know, I'm suspicious of anybody who's that stupid.
Well, there's a lot of people that are, and unfortunately, they've convinced a lot of grassroots people of that, too. Well, thank you so much for speaking about that. Again, your website is FukushimaUpdateReport.com. It's an aggregated site of information about Fukushima, which just keeps going. We're coming up to the 3rd-year anniversary. Thank you so much for telling us how to assess some of these. Well, actually, I guess we don't really have a good way to assess the danger, do we? That's really the takeaway, isn't it?
I don't think we do. We can't believe what the government says. We have no reliable institution anymore that would give us honest answers, and that's the sad part about it. How bad it is here with that, it is millions of times worse in Japan in the sense that those people don't have anybody to speak the truth to them at all. There's millions of children that have pre-lesion cancer lesions on their thyroid now when they could have spent less than $10 million handing out some iodine tablets to the entire country and no one would be affected.
And it's not just the Japanese government, it's the American government as well. They could have given those soldiers on the USS Reagan iodine tablets.
Yes. I mean, that's a war crime there.
So it's very difficult to know exactly what your radiation exposure is, and there's a few things that you can do to mitigate the damage to it, like iodine, other things, but basically it's very pessimistic if we don't get the nuclear power industry under control. Would you say?
I'd say it is. This is the kind of thing where it's kind of a doomsday situation, and people have asked me if it's such a doomsday scenario, how do you deal with it? How do you possibly deal with something like that a Carrington event could wipe us out? And I said, well, it comes back to my faith it comes back to the idea that God gave us something, and it's life, it's a gift, but he put physics restraints on it. And my friend says, physics? What are you talking about? And I said, well, God kind of knew what he was doing. He says, look, you can't live yesterday, and you can't live tomorrow. You can only live today. So my attitude is, okay, if I live today, I look outside and the sun's shining and the birds are chirping, and I can look at my wife and have a wonderful day. I live that day as though it may even be my last day, and I enjoy that day to its fullest. And then the next morning when I wake up and it's another wonderful day, I do the same thing. Because really all we can do is live each day the very best we can. And like I told a friend of mine, if you didn't kiss your wife goodbye going to work, shame on you.
That's really well put. I want to talk about a little bit about this book and the plot of this book. You've got a book there of short stories. You're also an author besides a scientist and inventor. This book here, let me get this here so they can get it on the camera. Tell us a little bit about this book. It's a fiction book.
Yes, it literally is something I dreamed. It's kind of strange in that sense, but this is a type of story that questions who has right to own another human being or patent a human being. It's an expose, so to speak, into almost an allegory about right and wrong, in that the government wanted to create the super soldiers and were creating some kind of synthetic DNA to modify human DNA and extra chromosomes. It didn't work, and only 2 people survived out of 2,500 implanted embryos, and it was a horrible disaster. But the 2 people that survived were very, very unique. And this is their story about how they have to play a cat and mouse game with the government and get away from them, because they are considered lab rats. They're not considered human beings because their DNA is patented. And I don't buy that. I don't buy the idea that somebody can patent DNA and own another human being, but that's what it's coming to.
Oh, we're that close away from it. We're very close to it. When they could patent the genes for that breast cancer test, fortunately that got struck down, but we also see what's happening with GMO patents from Monsanto, where they can claim that if they trespass, essentially cross-pollinating onto somebody else's field, they can claim that as copyright infringement, even though it's really fundamentally a trespass. They're polluting somebody else's field.
I have this one question, David. When do we say that the ends do not justify the means? Is there any with that kind of courage? Perhaps it must ultimately and sadly fall to those exploited by the game gone mad.
That's the ultimate question, isn't it?
Yes.
We see that question so many times. We need to ask that question to the engineers who start following down these dark paths without ever looking at the ethics or where this is going to ultimately lead. They're simply interested in solving the puzzle that's put in front of them, or getting the gold ring or the money or the award, whatever it is that motivates them, but they're not looking at the long-term consequences or the ethics. And that applies not just to the nuclear industry or the DNA industry, the biological industry, but it also applies to people who work for DARPA. We see some horrible stuff that could possibly come down the pike from that, and we've talked about that many times. You have so many different things in your background that we could talk to you about. We could go on forever, but we're out of time. Thank you for coming in and talking to us. It's been really wonderful meeting you.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you very much. And again, that website that he has is FukushimaUpdateReport.com. And if you want updates not only on Fukushima, but everything that's happening in America, the police state, environmental issues, stay tuned to Prison Planet TV. Support us as a subscriber. Your subscription can be shared with up to 10 other people at the same time. It's a great way to spread the information and to support our operation here. We'll be back tomorrow at 7 Central, 8 p.m. Eastern.
Now you can watch The Alex Jones Show live as it happens at Infowars.com/show.
You'll find links to all of our content there and a free 15-day trial for Prison Planet TV.
More than 60 movies and documentaries all in one place at Infowars.com/show.
The InfoWars crew absolutely loves coffee because we love being awake. And I am somewhat of a connoisseur of coffee. So many times you go to a restaurant or even to a coffee shop and the coffee tastes like garbage. And in all the different coffees I've tried, my favorite is grown in the high mountains, in shade, Arabica, on the border with Guatemala in southern Mexico by the Chiapas farmers. I make sure we've done the research. I make sure it's the very best product that we can offer you when I put my name on it. And I believe, and it's my taste, so you may differ, that this is the best coffee in the world from southern Mexico. Wake Up America Patriot Blend, 100% organic, Arabica shade grown. And then we have the Immune Support, 100% organic coffee, infused with a special type of mushroom known to boost the immunity.
This coffee is seriously so smooth. I normally have to douse my coffee with cream and sugar and cinnamon and all kinds of tasty treats, but this, I drink this black. It is so good.
Well, that's why I like it, is that it has a kick, it has really good caffeine in it, it has a good clean wake up that lasts for a long time, doesn't give me a headache, but it's so smooth, it's so delicious. Just try it out for yourself. I'm telling you, this is my favorite coffee. We went through a lot of trouble to bring you this. Just try it, and I think you'll be hooked like we are here at InfoWars. Well, folks, find out for yourself and support the information war today. It's all available at InfoWarsLife.com or by calling toll-free 888-253-3139.